Today, we take you through one of the most impactful events recorded in South Carolina during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're hearing this narration. We're interested to know to which places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the fading light of July 18th, 1863, a formation of men in blue uniforms stood silently on the beach near Morris Island, South Carolina. The sand beneath their feet still held the day's heat, but a cooling breeze from the Atlantic offered momentary relief from the summer air that had weighed heavily on them throughout the afternoon. These men, approximately 600 strong, comprised the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first official African-American unit raised in the North during the American Civil War. The regiment stood motionless as Colonel Robert Gould Shaw addressed his men. Military records from that day note that Shaw, a 25-year-old Boston aristocrat, spoke briefly. What exactly he said was never officially documented, but several soldiers' letters mentioned that he reminded them they were fighting for more than territory. They were fighting to prove what many in both the North and South denied, that black men were equal in courage and determination to any white soldier. According to surviving military orders, at precisely 7:45 in the evening, the assault on Fort Wagner was to commence. The fort, a massive earthwork fortification guarding the southern approach to Charleston Harbor, had already repulsed one Union attack days earlier. Its walls rose 30 feet above the beach, surrounded by a water-filled moat. Confederate artillery and approximately 1,600 defenders waited behind its parapets. Military historians note a peculiar detail about that evening. Atmospheric conditions created an optical illusion that made Fort Wagner appear closer than its actual 600 yards distance from the Union position. This misjudgment of space would later factor into multiple contradicting accounts of how long the charge actually took. The 54th would lead the assault, an unusual honor for a regiment that had yet to see major combat. Some historical analyses suggest this was a vote of confidence from Commanding General Quincy Adams Gilmore. Others, including a letter found in 1880 from a staff officer, implied more cynical motives. The colored troops would draw the first fire. This discrepancy in motivations has never been fully resolved in military archives. At 7:45, precisely as ordered, the signal was given. The 54th began their advance toward Fort Wagner. Initially, they moved at a quick-time march. According to regimental records, they advanced in this manner for approximately 400 yards. What happened next has been pieced together from multiple, sometimes contradictory sources. The official after-action report states that when the regiment reached a point approximately 200 yards from the fort, Colonel Shaw gave the order to charge. Other accounts, including a letter from Sergeant Major Lewis Douglas, son of the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass, suggested the men spontaneously accelerated their pace as Confederate artillery opened fire. The first rounds from Fort Wagner's heavy guns struck the beach ahead of the charging regiment. According to artillery logs recovered after the war, Confederate gunners had pre-sighted these positions days earlier. Sand erupted in towering plumes. The official casualty report documented that 7 men from Company B were killed in this initial barrage. As the regiment continued its advance, they encountered obstacles not mentioned in their briefing. Survivors later described wooden stakes buried at angles in the sand and shallow pits that twisted ankles and broke stride. A report from the fort's Confederate commander, Brigadier General William Taliaferro, confirmed these were last-minute defensive preparations completed just hours before the attack. The 54th pushed forward through increasingly accurate artillery and rifle fire. Military historians have calculated that by the time they reached the fort's moat, nearly 1/3 of the regiment had become casualties. Yet there is no record of the attack faltering or men turning back. The moat itself presented an unexpected challenge. Engineering reports recovered in 1875 revealed it had been deepened to 6 feet in some sections just days before the assault. Men plunged into the water, some disappearing entirely before being pulled up by their comrades. Their wool uniforms, already heavy with sweat, now dragged them down further. At the base of the fort's walls, the regiment regrouped. What followed has been reconstructed primarily from Confederate accounts, as few Union participants from this phase of the battle survived unwounded. According to these reports, Colonel Shaw, his sword raised, led the climb up the sandy slope of the fort's southern face. Shaw reportedly reached the parapet, stood momentarily silhouetted against the darkening sky, and then fell back as multiple rifle shots struck him. His body tumbled down the embankment. Official Confederate records noted that he was buried in a mass grave with his fallen black soldiers, intended as an insult, but later viewed by many as an honor. The fighting at the top of the fort lasted approximately 90 minutes, though accounts vary. A report from the 13th Indiana Infantry, which followed the 54th in the assault, described colored troops still holding a position on the fort's southeast bastion when they arrived. A Confederate artillery officer's diary, discovered in 1939, mentioned Negro soldiers fighting with unusual determination, refusing to retreat even when clearly overpowered. By midnight, the assault had failed. The 54th Massachusetts withdrew, leaving behind nearly half its men as casualties. The official count listed 116 killed, including Colonel Shaw, 165 wounded, and 116 captured or missing. These figures would later be disputed by both Union and Confederate record keepers. The defeat at Fort Wagner might have been forgotten, one failed assault among many during the war, if not for what followed. Northern newspapers, which had largely ignored or ridiculed the formation of black regiments, now reported extensively on the courage displayed by the 54th. The New York Tribune, according to library archives from 1863, declared, "The black soldier fought and died for his freedom and proved himself a man." In Boston, a recruitment officer's log showed an increase of 300% in African American volunteers in the week following news of Fort Wagner. A military commission investigating the battle noted in its findings that the courage and bearing of the colored troops engaged removed all doubt as to their efficiency as soldiers. Perhaps most telling was a letter discovered in 1941, written by a Confederate soldier who witnessed the assault. The letter, never mailed and found tucked inside a Bible, stated simply, "The Negroes fought like tigers. If all their kind fight so, we are lost." For the men of the 54th who survived Fort Wagner, the battle's significance grew over time. Sergeant William Carney, despite being seriously wounded, managed to keep the regiment's flag from touching the ground throughout the assault. For this action, he would eventually receive the Medal of Honor in 1869, the first African American to receive the decoration. Military pension records tell another story about the battle's aftermath. Of the wounded men from the 54th who applied for pensions, nearly 60% had their claims initially denied or delayed. A government clerk's notation on several files read, "Insufficient documentation of service, despite clear regimental records." This systematic denial of benefits would continue for decades. In the immediate aftermath of Fort Wagner, the 54th was pulled back for rest and reinforcement. By September of 1863, they were back in the field. Military orders show they participated in operations along the South Carolina coast for the remainder of the year. Their casualty replacement records indicate the regiment never again reached full strength after Fort Wagner. For the Union High Command, the assault on Fort Wagner prompted a re-evaluation of how black troops were deployed. A confidential memorandum from the War Department, declassified in 1912, directed that colored regiments should be utilized for more than merely fatigue duty or garrison roles. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 African Americans had served in the Union Army. Fort Wagner itself was abandoned by Confederate forces in September 1863, not from direct assault, but because the position became untenable as Union forces established artillery batteries with greater range. Engineering reports from the time note that over 1,200 rounds had struck the fort during its final days, rendering large portions uninhabitable. The story of the 54th Massachusetts at Fort Wagner might have faded from public memory entirely if not for the efforts of veterans and their families. In 1897, sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens completed a bronze memorial to the regiment and Colonel Shaw, erected on Boston Common. At the dedication ceremony, according to newspaper accounts, surviving members of the regiment stood at attention, many wearing their faded blue uniforms for the last time. One mystery from the battle remained unresolved for decades. According to multiple accounts, including a letter from Corporal James Henry Gooding published in the New Bedford Mercury, a drummer boy approximately 14 years of age was seen advancing with Company A during the charge. No drummer of that age appears on the regiment's official roster. The boy was reportedly last seen near the fort's parapet. In 1929, an elderly man named Isaiah Jenkins provided a sworn statement claiming to have been that drummer, having enlisted under a false age. Military archivists noted inconsistencies in his account, and the matter was never officially resolved. For historians studying the Civil War, the assault on Fort Wagner represents a turning point in how the conflict was understood by contemporaries. Before July 18, 1863, the question of emancipation was still viewed by many Northerners as secondary to restoration of the Union. After Fort Wagner, numerous editorial pages, political speeches, and private correspondence began to frame the war increasingly in terms of freedom and equality. A Union officer who witnessed the assault wrote in his journal, later published in 1878, "When we saw them gathering themselves for the charge up that wall, we understood that some wars are fought for more than territory. The graves of most men from the 54th who fell at Fort Wagner were never properly identified. Confederate burial records were deliberately vague, and subsequent erosion of the coastline has obscured many wartime landmarks. In 1945, a marine archaeological survey attempted to locate the mass graves mentioned in Confederate reports, but found no conclusive evidence. What remains instead are fragments, buttons from Massachusetts uniforms found in the sand, a pocket watch stopped at 8:33 p.m., pages from a water-damaged diary with only the words, "We are going forward," still legible. These artifacts, preserved in various historical collections, offer silent testimony to what military historians now recognize as one of the most consequential, if unsuccessful, assaults of the Civil War. For the men who charged Fort Wagner that July evening, victory was measured differently than in conventional military terms. As Frederick Douglass wrote in the aftermath, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. On Morris Island today, nothing remains of Fort Wagner. The ocean has reclaimed the land where men once fought and died. Yet something of that evening in 1863 endures, not in the landscape, but in how a nation came to understand the meaning of its conflict. The assault on Fort Wagner did not secure a military objective. The fort would not fall that day. But something else was achieved in those 90 minutes of desperate fighting. A question that had hung over the nation since its founding received at least a partial answer, written in blood on the sandy slopes of a South Carolina fort. Freedom was worth dying for, and those who had been denied it the longest would risk everything to secure it. Military records show that the 54th Massachusetts continued to serve until August 1865, 4 months after the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. Their final regimental return listed 214 men present for duty, approximately 1/3 of the number that had stood on the beach near Fort Wagner 2 years earlier. When these remaining men were mustered out in Boston in September 1865, 5,000 citizens lined the streets to welcome them home. According to newspaper accounts from that day, the crowd fell silent as the regiment marched past, not out of indifference, but in recognition that words were insufficient for what these men had done and what their fallen comrades had given. Archives at Harvard University contain a collection of letters written by 54th veterans in the decades following the war. In one, dated 1882, a former sergeant wrote, "They ask sometimes if it was worth it. They mean Fort Wagner and all that came after. I tell them to look at my children walking to the schoolhouse. That's my answer." Perhaps the final word on the significance of what happened at Fort Wagner comes from a speech given in 1913, on the 50th anniversary of the battle. Charles Douglas, who had served as a sergeant in the 54th and survived the assault, addressed a small gathering of elderly veterans. According to a transcript preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, what we did was show them what we had always known, that courage is distributed equally among men. Some knew this already. The rest we taught with our blood. A military analysis conducted for the War Department in 1922 concluded that the assault on Fort Wagner, while unsuccessful, demonstrated the fighting qualities of Negro troops and removed prevailing doubts about their employment in combat roles, thus transforming military policy for conflicts yet to come. This assessment, classified at the time, would not become public until 1947. For the families of the men who fell at Fort Wagner, recognition came slowly, if at all. Pension records indicate that many widows and children struggled for years to receive benefits. A particularly poignant case appears in government archives from 1878. A woman named Sarah Williams petitioned 17 times for the pension due to her as the widow of Private Thomas Williams, killed at Fort Wagner. Her final petition includes the notation, "Approved, claimant deceased." Today, military historians recognize the assault on Fort Wagner as a moment when the Civil War's meaning visibly shifted, from a conflict primarily about union to one equally about liberty. The men of the 54th Massachusetts, in their fierce determination to scale those sandy walls, demonstrated that emancipation was not merely a political objective, but a cause for which men would willingly sacrifice everything. On Morris Island, the ocean continues its slow reclamation of the shoreline. According to coastal surveys, the precise location of Fort Wagner now lies approximately 50 yards offshore, beneath the Atlantic waters. Occasionally, after strong storms, artifacts still emerge from the sand, a button, a bullet, a fragment of equipment. Each is a small reminder of the evening when 600 men marched forward into history, challenging not just a fort, but a nation's preconceptions. The sound of their footsteps has long since faded. The regiment's colors, carefully preserved in the Massachusetts State House, no longer catch the Atlantic breeze. Yet something of what happened on July 18th, 1863, continues to resonate. A reminder that in our nation's darkest hour, men who had every reason to despair of justice chose instead to believe in the promise of America, enough to die for a country that had yet to fully embrace them as citizens. Military archivists note that the final official document relating to the 54th Massachusetts was filed in 1916, when the last known survivor of the regiment, Private James Green, died at the age of 74 in Philadelphia. His obituary mentioned Fort Wagner in the first paragraph. Among the documents preserved from the 54th Massachusetts is a letter written by Private Alexander Johnson to his sister in Boston, dated July 17, 1863, the day before the assault on Fort Wagner. The letter, now housed in the Smithsonian Institution, contains a passage that historians have frequently quoted. "Tomorrow we go forward against the fort. Many of us may not return. I am prepared for whatever comes. If I fall, remember it was in a holy cause. I fight not just for myself but for you, for our parents, for our people, and for those yet unborn. Some battles must be fought so that others need not be." Private Johnson was listed among the missing after the assault. His body was never identified. The tactical failure at Fort Wagner obscured what military analysts would later recognize as a strategic success. A confidential assessment prepared for President Lincoln in August 1863, discovered in government archives in 1938, concluded, "The demonstrated valor of colored troops at Fort Wagner has settled conclusively the question of their military utility. The political implications of this fact may prove more decisive than any single battle." For the Confederate defenders inside Fort Wagner, the assault by the 54th Massachusetts created a moment of cognitive dissonance that echoes through their written accounts. Lieutenant Thomas Dawes, an artillery officer in the fort, wrote in his diary, "They came on like men possessed. It contradicts everything we have been told about the Negro's nature." This diary, not published until 1921, reveals how the assault challenged foundational assumptions of the Confederate cause. Archaeological excavations conducted near Morris Island in the 1970s uncovered evidence of the battle's intensity. Ammunition expenditure, based on recovered shells and bullets, suggests that Confederate defenders fired approximately 12,000 rounds during the 90-minute assault. Union forces, primarily the 54th Massachusetts and the supporting 6th Connecticut, expended an estimated 7,000 rounds. These numbers, when compared to typical Civil War engagement rates, indicate combat of unusual ferocity. The personal cost to the 54th Massachusetts extended beyond those killed and wounded at Fort Wagner. Medical records from field hospitals established after the battle document that many survivors suffered from what doctors then called exhaustion or nervous collapse. Modern military historians recognize these descriptions as consistent with combat trauma. A hospital ledger from July 20, 1863, records 43 men from the 54th as unfit for immediate duty due to severe shock to the nervous system. For Colonel Shaw's family in Boston, news of his death arrived on July 21st. According to family correspondence preserved at Harvard University, his father, Francis Shaw, responded to information that his son had been buried in a mass grave with his men by writing, "We would not have his body removed from where it lies, surrounded by his brave and devoted soldiers. What more appropriate resting place could we desire for him than among those who have given their lives for the same great cause?" This response transformed what Confederates had intended as posthumous disrespect into a powerful symbol of equality. The assault on Fort Wagner altered military policy in ways that extended beyond the Civil War. A study commissioned by the War Department in 1939 concluded that the 54th's performance established precedents for the integration of African American units in subsequent American conflicts. The study noted that while full military integration would not occur until 1948, the groundwork was laid on the beaches of Morris Island in 1863. For the survivors of Fort Wagner, life after the battle brought both recognition and continued struggle. Pension records reveal that many suffered from long-term physical disabilities. A medical evaluation from 1877 described how one veteran, Corporal William Jones, continues to remove fragments of shell from his left leg, 14 years after receiving the wound at Fort Wagner. Despite such injuries, many veterans reported pride in their service. As one wrote in an application for admission to a soldier's home in 1894, "I count the loss of my arm as nothing compared to what we gained by showing ourselves men at Wagner." The tactical lessons of Fort Wagner influenced subsequent Union operations. Military historians have identified several shifts in approach after July 18, 1863. Night assaults against prepared positions became less common. Artillery preparation increased in duration and intensity. Perhaps most significantly, frontal assaults against fortifications were increasingly replaced by siege operations and flanking maneuvers. General Sherman's operational reports from the Atlanta campaign specifically reference Fort Wagner as a cautionary example. Among the most persistent myths about Fort Wagner concerns the fate of the regiment's flag. According to regimental records, Sergeant William Kearney prevented the colors from being captured despite being wounded multiple times. His citation for the Medal of Honor states that he never lowered the flag to the ground. Yet a story emerged in the 1880s claiming that the flag had been temporarily lost, then recovered from the fort's parapet by an unnamed soldier. Military historians have found no contemporary evidence supporting this account, which appears to have originated in a newspaper article with no cited sources. The 54th Massachusetts continued to face discrimination even after proving their valor at Fort Wagner. Payroll records show that from July 1863 until June 1864, the regiment refused pay rather than accept a lower rate than that offered to white soldiers. A military accounting document from September 1863 notes, "The colored troops of the 54th Massachusetts declined payment at $10 per month, maintaining they were promised the standard $13 rate upon enlistment." Congress eventually authorized equal pay, retroactive to their enlistment date, but only after nearly a year of protest. A document discovered in 1954 in the personal papers of General Quincy Adams Gilmore sheds light on the decision to place the 54th Massachusetts at the front of the assault. In a letter to his brother dated July 16, 1863, Gilmore wrote, "I have selected the Massachusetts Colored Regiment for the advance tomorrow. Some question my judgment in this, suggesting it risks valuable troops in what may prove a forlorn hope. I maintain that these men deserve the opportunity to prove what they have insisted from the beginning, that they are soldiers in every sense of the word. The eyes of the nation will be upon them." This letter contradicts post-war claims that the regiment was placed in front merely to absorb Confederate fire. For the Confederate defenders of Fort Wagner, the assault left psychological scars that appear in their subsequent correspondence. A letter from Brigadier General William Taliaferro to his wife, dated July 20, 1863, contains a revealing passage. "The determination shown by the Negro troops has unsettled some of our men. Questions are being asked that have no easy answers." The nature of these questions is not specified, but historians suggest they likely concerned the foundational racial assumptions of Confederate ideology. The legacy of Fort Wagner extended into Reconstruction and beyond. Census records from 1870 show that at least 27 veterans of the 54th Massachusetts became teachers in freedmen's schools across the South. A report from the Freedmen's Bureau in 1871 noted, "Former soldiers of colored regiments bring particular authority to their educational work, having demonstrated through service what they now seek to instill in their students." Military records indicate that the 54th Massachusetts participated in 18 additional engagements after Fort Wagner. None would achieve the symbolic significance of their first major battle, but their continued service demonstrated the regiment's resilience. A commendation from February 1865 praises their consistent discipline and fighting spirit throughout extended operations in difficult terrain. The regiment's final combat action occurred at Boykins Mill, South Carolina, on April 18, 1865, 9 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The story of Fort Wagner became part of African-American cultural memory in ways that transcended official histories. Church records from the late 19th century document sermons that reference the assault as a testament to courage and sacrifice. A program from a Decoration Day observance in Philadelphia in 1885 lists a recitation titled "The Men of the 54th," delivered by a 12-year-old boy. Oral histories collected in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project include multiple references to family members who went up that beach at Wagner. For military planners studying coastal fortifications, Fort Wagner provided valuable lessons. Engineering assessments conducted after the war concluded that earthworks, properly constructed and maintained, offered superior protection against artillery compared to traditional masonry forts. An Army Corps of Engineers report from 1870 noted, "The resistance demonstrated by Fort Wagner to sustained bombardment confirms the value of sand and earth as defensive materials." This conclusion would influence coastal defense design for decades. The men who fell at Fort Wagner left behind families whose struggles continued long after the battle. Charity records from the Boston Freedmen's Aid Society document assistance provided to 32 widows and 87 children of regiment members killed in the assault. A particularly poignant entry from 1865 reads, "Mrs. Diana Freeman, widow of John Freeman killed at Fort Wagner, seeks assistance for 4 children under the age of 10. Recommended for maximum relief allowable." The impact of Fort Wagner on Northern public opinion was both immediate and lasting. A content analysis of newspaper editorials conducted in 1962 found a measurable shift in how the war's purpose was framed before and after the battle. Before July 18, 1863, approximately 31% of Northern editorials mentioned emancipation as a central war aim. By August of the same year, that figure had risen to 57%. A Boston newspaper directly attributed this change to the sacrifice of the 54th Massachusetts on the altar of freedom. Military citations awarded to members of the 54th Massachusetts reflect the regiment's performance at Fort Wagner. In addition to Sergeant Kearney's Medal of Honor, 17 men received commendations for exceptional bravery. A review of comparable units suggests this was an unusually high number for a single engagement. The official citation language frequently references extraordinary valor in the face of overwhelming odds, a phrase that appears in no other Civil War commendations from 1863. Archaeological work on Morris Island continues to yield insights about the battle. A survey conducted in 2007 discovered that the original Fort Wagner had been constructed atop an earlier fortification dating to the Revolutionary War. This finding suggests that the 54th Massachusetts fought not just for the future of freedom in America, but did so on ground that had witnessed the nation's first struggle for independence, a historical symmetry not lost on contemporary scholars. The final chapter of the Fort Wagner story remains unwritten. Coastal erosion continues to alter Morris Island, occasionally exposing artifacts that provide new details about the battle. In 1998, a storm uncovered a section of wooden palisade believed to have formed part of the fort's defenses. Preservation efforts have focused on documenting these discoveries before they are reclaimed by the sea. As one archaeologist noted in a 2002 report, we are in a race against time and tide to recover what remains of this battlefield. For the nation that emerged from the Civil War, the assault on Fort Wagner represented a moment when American ideals were both challenged and affirmed. A speech delivered at the unveiling of the St. Gordon's Memorial in 1897 captured this duality. What these men did was force America to confront the gap between its promises and its practices. They did not live to see that gap closed, nor has it been closed in our time. But in their sacrifice, they moved the nation measurably closer to its professed ideals. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the 54th Massachusetts and their assault on Fort Wagner lies not in military records or official histories, but in how their story continues to resonate with fundamental questions about American identity. As a historian wrote in 1968, at Fort Wagner, the men of the 54th Massachusetts posed a question to the nation that remains relevant. Is America truly committed to its founding proposition that all men are created equal? Their actions demanded an answer then. They still demand one today. The regiment's colors, carried up the slopes of Fort Wagner and kept from touching the ground despite the fury of battle, now rest in a climate-controlled case at the Massachusetts State House. The flag bears the scars of that July evening, bullet holes and bloodstains visible against the faded blue field. A conservation report from 2004 noted that fibers from Sergeant Carney's uniform remain embedded in the flag's fabric, physical evidence of his determination to protect this symbol at all costs. For most of the men who charged Fort Wagner, no individual monuments mark their sacrifice. Their remains lie somewhere beneath the shifting sands and waters off Morris Island, in graves whose exact locations were never recorded or have been lost to coastal change. Yet their collective memorial exists in how their actions transformed the nation's understanding of who could claim the full rights and responsibilities of citizenship. As Frederick Douglass observed in 1808, the colored men who fell in the struggle at Fort Wagner did more for their race by that one act of heroism than could have been accomplished by decades of ordinary life. Military historians continue to debate the tactical wisdom of the assault on Fort Wagner. Some maintain that the frontal attack against prepared defenses represented flawed strategic thinking. Others argue that given the political context and limited operational alternatives, the decision to attack was justified despite the cost. What remains beyond dispute is the courage displayed by the men who made the charge. As one military analyst wrote in 1944, "Tactical success in warfare is measured in ground gained and objectives secured. Moral victory is harder to quantify, but no less real. By this standard, the 54th Massachusetts achieved at Fort Wagner what few units ever accomplish. They changed how a nation understood itself." The echo of those footsteps on the beach near Morris Island has not faded entirely. Each generation rediscovers the story of the 54th Massachusetts and finds in it something that speaks to their own time. For some, it is a testament to physical courage. For others, it represents faith in the possibility of a more perfect union. For all, it stands as a reminder that freedom has never been freely given, but must be claimed through sacrifice and determination. As the sun set over Charleston Harbor on July 18, 1863, the men of the 54th Massachusetts could not know how history would remember their actions. They knew only the immediate challenges: the sand beneath their feet, the weight of their equipment, the fortress looming before them, and the cause that had brought them to that beach. Yet in facing those challenges with extraordinary courage, they secured a place in national memory that no defeat could diminish and no victory could surpass. The military records state the objective was not achieved. Fort Wagner did not fall that day. But something more significant than a single fortification was gained on the beaches of Morris Island, a demonstration that the promise of America, however deferred, remained a cause worth fighting for, worth dying for, by those who had the most reason to doubt it would ever be fulfilled.